Hello YouTube. I just want to talk to you a little bit today about blade geometry and basically make the case for carrying a thinner bladed knife as an EDC. Okay, so for an everyday carry roll, mostly I'm just cutting packaging such as cardboard. That thick plastic packaging seems to come on everything nowadays. That's kind of difficult to get to without a knife. And you know, paper like envelopes, things like that. That's mostly what I cut on an EDC basis. Some people lead more interesting lives than I do, and they seem to need sharpened pry bars, what I call sharpened pry bars. So I've got examples of a few different knives here, and I've got two on loan from a buddy, these two here, just to help me illustrate my point. And I'd just like to preface this video by saying I'm not saying that sharpened pry bars or you know, really thick knives don't have their place. They definitely do, and they are useful. But for an EDC roll, me personally, I'll take a thinner blade every time. Alright, so let's get into it. Basically, let's start with some words on geometry. By having a thin blade, I only have to get this width through something. So when I start cutting, whether that's in a piercing motion or slicing straight down, I only have to worry about that amount of thickness. And something like this, it's not very wide, but it doesn't start off very thick. So it doesn't need a lot of space, a lot of real estate to get to the cutting edge. Okay, and that's actually what I find interesting about the Bawidaman blades, or the Bawidaman blades. One day I'll learn how to say it right. Is that by starting, you know, by having so much real estate to work with, so much width, they can have a good thick spine. But because they start way back here and they taper off, you know, you may get to this thickness right here on the spine of this Swiss Army knife, way back here, which could actually be thicker than the entire Swiss Army knife blade. Okay, but you achieve basically a lot more slicing ability because it's so wide right there from the taper, and you still get a lot of good strength on the back. Okay, so I actually have grown to like these knife designs because they give me that really good slicing ability while retaining a lot of the strength that I would get on, you know, what I like to call sharpened pry bars. And now to illustrate that point, or to help me, is the Strider knife. Because it's so thick, all right, they don't have a lot of real estate here, a lot of width to work with. They've got to get to the edge, that thickness to a knife edge, in that tiny amount of space. Okay, they just don't have a lot to work with, so it's gonna be thick. Basically, you know what you're looking at. Instead of something nice and sharp like that, you're working with something that's real, you know, out there. So what's going to happen is, as you're cutting, you're going to hit the shoulder first a lot sooner than you will on something like over here. So the shoulder is going to make contact with whatever it is you're trying to cut, and at a certain point, the edge is not even going to be coming into the picture anymore. You're going to be forcing through the material on the shoulder of your knife, where these grinds change, right? From your primary to secondary, secondary bevels. So as you're pushing through, at a certain point, it's just brute force, and you're tearing it more than you're cutting it. That might not be such a bad thing if, for instance, you're working with wood. All right, if you're going to baton and you're going to be a lot of impact and just doing crazy stuff, then yeah, you want something like this, and that'll actually save your edge in the long run, because at a certain point, your edge is not going to be contacting the wood. This here, right there and right here, this is what's going to be splitting the wood, right? So that's great. Problem is, I don't really do that in my EDC. Just my everyday life, I need something more like this that can slice through packaging, and my cutting surface may only be from here to here. This is the only part of the blade that may be slicing through something, and that means I'm going to get friction. I'm going to get into the cutting medium, right? Or how should I say this? The object that I'm cutting is going to be sliding along the blade the whole length of the blade. So if I have something that's really wide, I've got to get through all that every time I'm cutting something. So let's example time. Alright, if I've got a piece of cardboard and I want to cut with it through the Strider, okay, and now we're not talking about edge sharpness, so I don't want to hear a lot of people say, oh, it wasn't sharp, or this was sharper than that. Okay, we know it may not start cutting right away, but we're talking about what happens once you make that first penetration, you actually start cutting. So let's get in there, right? Okay, so now you're in there, but look at how, I mean, it's actually kind of difficult to cut. And especially if this is really long, like say this is a foot or two, this is going to be more in line. It's not going to start spreading like this. It's going to be like that. And you're going to have to force your way through it. See how wide that is, how you're having to cut all the way through it. Can it do it? Yeah, sure, it can do it. And it's not even really a problem, right? I mean, bam, you cut right through it. But if you're cutting a lot, if you're processing a whole lot of cardboard, or you're just cutting through a whole lot of packaging, which sometimes if I'm breaking down a box, or maybe 2 boxes, 3 boxes, I mean, I've been moving recently, and I find myself that, you know, I'm in that position. You're gonna have to work a lot harder with this, and you're gonna feel it. Whereas if you have something like this Army knife, you can cut into that, and look, it just slices all the way through. If I hold it right there, it's like no problem, right? No problem. It just cuts right through because it's thinner. And now let's try to illustrate that point with a water bottle. Once again, I really don't do this in my EDC world, but Tonto point, right? Great for stabbing, for penetrating. But let's see. You can see the bottle bending, how much it bends, and then once it makes the penetration, look, it's not sliding through. There it is, bam. Now you got less friction, right? But okay, now it went through. So remember that. Now let's go to the SOG. If I'm pushing this one in, start to bend, boom. Look at how fast that went in, and how deep it went in, just right away, because it's thinner. Once it gets about that far in, you know, right about there, that's as wide as it's going to be. It'll just slide right in. So you can actually achieve greater penetration, right? And here's the Swiss Army knife, and this is actually kind of dangerous. It'll slide through really fast, so I've got to make sure I'm at the right angle. Okay, takes a little bit longer to pierce in, right? It's not a Tonto or anything. Boom, look at that. I've almost gone through and cut myself a few. Oh, look at that. I would have cut myself if I would have had my hand here. So knife safety tip, right? But what happened right there? It's not that it had a Tonto point or it was some super secret, you know, hardcore blade design. It's because it's thin. Once it makes that first penetration, it just goes straight in. So if I'm trying to open something, or even trying to make this cut, oh, there's interesting. Look at it. It just slides right in, right? It just starts opening, separating. Let's do this. I'll even start out with the cut. All right, I'll use that same hole from the Swiss Army knife. Get in there, you. Oh, look, see? Look at how much harder this is going to be. Now, this is where the blade comes in, as if it was sharper, right? But do you see how it's just bending the plastic? You're not getting a very clean cut. That's what happens when you have a really wide blade. So once again, I'm not saying they don't have their purpose, right? But for EDC, for cutting, for just performance of the blade, I'm always going to go with a thinner blade, and that's why I like these two knives here the most out of any of these, because they're that good in between. They're really good at, you know, penetrating and cutting, because they're not quite as thick as this, but they have a lot more strength than over here at this end of the table. So just my thoughts. If anybody feels differently, or you want to make the case for a thicker knife versus a thinner knife, maybe you use them differently than I do, or you have some different perspectives, I'd love to hear from you. You know, do a video response, and you know, educate me as to how you use your blades, because I'm always wanting to learn about them, and I always want to learn how other people use their knives. For me, for my philosophy of use, that's what I prefer, a thinner blade for EDC. Hope it was informative. Thanks for watching.